Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Energy RX. I am so excited to introduce you to this next guest. This next guest is Derek Pugh, who's written a new fabulous book called The All Manifesting. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Derek's history before we get into this, so you know this amazing man that you're about to hear wisdom from. Derek is a serial entrepreneur and became aware of a number of self-limiting beliefs and patterns that he found were diminishing his effectiveness as a business leader and his ability to live his fullest life. Wanting to rid himself of these beliefs and better understand how to intentionally manifest his reality, he began a meditation practice used by the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. As a result of that practice was a number of revelations about the nature of reality, the sources of self-imposed limitations, and the way to break free from those to live a boundless, full life to full potential. Derek is about to share those thoughts and revelations here with us today, right now. So, Derek, thank you for being here. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you.
Oh, thank you, Christine. This is a lot of fun.
It's so fun. So Derek and I actually know each other personally. He's a lovely friend and his lovely wife. We're friends with them. So we've known each other for a few years. And so Derek, in the past couple of years, as I've been hearing tidbits about these things he's been doing, and then suddenly this incredible book like appeared out of the ethers. It dropped in the All Manifesting. And Derek's history, he's been a lifelong, incredible entrepreneurs doing lots of incredible businesses. And suddenly it seems like there was this pivot from just the entrepreneurial business side to really moving into the side of manifestation, of working with energy. So I would just love to hear a little bit, Derek, kind of about how this all began for you and like how you came across all of this.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a pivot. It's actually, I think this is integral into everybody's life. So
Mm-hmm.
I think it was just maybe becoming more aware and trying to integrate things that maybe we should all be spending time thinking about every day that we normally do not into our daily lives and better understanding sort of our place in the universe and how that integrates into decisions we make every day, what we think our reality is every day. So I had started in this pathway not intending to write this book at all. I was having sort of a recurring set of self-limiting thoughts that were, I would say, blocking me when I was doing some of my startup work, probably blocking me in my regular relationships as well. And they came by way a lot of some self-limiting thoughts come to all of us, right? Somebody has said something to you, or you've had some experience, and then you wind up with affirmations in your regular life, and it begins to build into its own thing.
Right.
And I wasn't looking to go to a mind coach, mindset coach, or to a therapist over this. I was more interested in trying to get to the fundamental reason of why was I manifesting this particular reality? What did, like what was it that got me to this spot?
Right.
Not in terms of the traumas, but in terms of how like my biological existence was. And I went to a CEO coach who brought me into this meditation training that you talked about, which, yes, was used by the CIA. It was originally developed, as you and I talked about before the podcast, by the Monroe Institute.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really just a pathway to something else called hemisync. Some people call it binaural. Other people call it frequency following effect. Those are just techniques to move your mind into a particular state. But what you do in that state and what you attempt to figure out, that's your own journey. That's, like I said before, the hemisync itself is just like a stadium. And what happens in the stadium is up to the people in the stadium. So,
Okay.
so that's where it started. And I got very deep into that meditation, had some very unusual experiences in that meditation that led me to believe that my journey was very accurate. Like what I was doing was exactly what I should have been doing. And as I was getting these revelations pretty much on a daily basis, I was writing them down on paper. And about a year into the meditation, I looked at the paper and I was like, people need to know this. And so I started putting it together in the form of a book. And it's a very unusual book because it covers a lot of areas, not just thoughts, philosophy, and maybe even religious thoughts on reality, but astrophysics and marketing and psychological economics, you name it. It crosses a lot of things, but it's all to get to the same point, which is like where does our manifestation of reality come from, and how passive is that? And shouldn't we be living a life where we're intentionally creating that manifestation in tune with what I would call our inner compass, our intuition, or what you as the Energy RX, I think, would talk about as
Mhm.
the sort of consistent background of our integration into everything else. And that led to, just a complete change in my life that I wanted to share with everybody. The book that resulted in the book, and then finally the book hit Amazon, and then you start realizing that you get siloed by algorithms. So I think this morning I looked, and my book is characterized as occult Rosicrucianism, and I think it was number 3 in occult Rosicrucianism this morning, and then it was
Okay.
number 10 in Hermetic Rosicrucianism, I think, and then the one that seems broader, conscious thoughtfulness, I think it was number 15 this morning, which is great.
Wow. That sounds pretty amazing, actually.
Yeah,
It hasn't been out that long,
it's
too.
been out for like 3 days.
Yeah.
But so I mean, so either the good news is my book is at least getting into some people's hands, and maybe the
Yeah.
other news is that maybe books in this topic don't have as many sales as you might think. But it's great. It's great that people are actually starting to buy it and they want to read it and figure out this. What I think is a relatively unique journey.
And also when you put out something like this in the universe too, I mean, certainly there's been incredible inventors who didn't necessarily see the power of their work, but you're really delivering something that's for you to see right now, but also for humanity in the future, which is kind of a gift to humanity in a way that you don't always see it in the number of sales in the moment, but you don't know where it's going to land in the next year, 5 years, 100 years.
Oh, totally agree. And I think what was really interesting about this, you have been much more deeply rooted in our conversations. We've had historically in
Hmm.
things like classic yoga and other forms of philosophy and religious views
Sure.
on energy, which I
Hmm.
really wasn't. And when I went through this meditation, I came out with this manuscript and then shared it with friends who are serious writers. I can't say I was a serious writer when I went to do this, but serious writers who've written books, have been New York Times bestsellers and other things.
Yeah.
And they came back and said, well, have you read this or this or this? And I think the fascinating thing was how consistent what I had had revelations on were with things like classic yoga or astrophysics or Hermetic philosophy, which is why they're picking this up.
Right.
Particularly Hermetic, I wouldn't say traditional Hermetic philosophy, which is more like occult Hermetic philosophy, but what people call New Thought Hermetic philosophy, which was embodied in a book called The Kybalion that came out at the turn of the
Mhm.
20th century.
Yeah.
It's just amazing to me. I think in some ways felt the truth of what had come to me independently because of the fact that it resonated with thousands of years of thought or hundreds of years of thought, depending on where it was, in ways that were a little more modern than where those writings were, but in a way that I think was more applicable to someone who's alive today because we live in our world now. And I just, it literally has been a complete passion project for me. So once I wrote it and it was down, this has to go. This has to get out. People need a chance to read this.
Okay, so I want to make sure what I'm understanding what you're saying. That you don't have like you haven't spent a lot of time studying hermetic philosophy and astrophysics and yogic philosophy, that wasn't part of you spent a lot of time studying and learning about this, but you rather started this technique using, at least in the beginning, this hemisync meditation that got you into a state where you felt this connection to I would almost describe it as like a bandwidth of information, that maybe you were tapping into a certain bandwidth of information that maybe these other philosophers or religious scholars tapped into, and you're able to tap into that bandwidth of information and deliver it with this modern twist to it that is more applicable, that people today can understand, as opposed to reading the Kabbalion, which is written in a way that's not necessarily easy to digest. Is that what I'm understanding?
100%. I'm not, I mean, I attempted to make my book as easy to digest as possible. I think
Mhm.
when I got through it, and I've had PhDs and doctors and all sorts of people read it, I think one of the intentions of the book is that a lot of the sentences just require their own breath in the book. And I think we're used to flying through literature now just to get
Yeah.
the gist of what it is. And there's a
Mhm.
lot of integrated concepts in there. And every now and then someone will come back and say, I really wish you would have expanded on this particular topic in the book. And everybody was different. And my reaction was, I didn't intentionally expand on the topic because I need you to do that expansion yourself as you read, because you
Mm.
won't, if I spoon feed it to you, you won't build the understanding that I'm trying to pass through to you.
Mm.
So it's a very dense book. In
Okay.
that it's only 100 and I think and 45 pages long or something. But literally, you have to take a breath around some of the sentences and just try and understand it, because there's concepts in there that should be things that we think about all the time, but because they're so not what we think about every time, you almost can gloss through them and not get the understanding that I'm trying to convey. And I'm not sure how else I would do it other than say the same thing, 50 times over and over again.
Right.
But it is in its own way, has some of the same complexities as say the Kybalion had, or Inner Engineering by Sadhguru is an interesting book. James Doty's Mind Magic, interesting medical book along the
Mhm.
same sort of lines. So I've read an awful lot since I wrote this.
Okay.
I had already read a fair amount of astrophysics, but an awful lot, all the way to new books on gravity, and like quantum gravity. It's fascinating to me that all of these things have their own history and their own genre, but they relate to each other in ways that maybe each one of them doesn't notice. And the book tries to relate all of them together.
Okay, so I have to ask, this is the first time I've heard this term of quantum gravity. Can you explain that a little bit? Because it's rare for me to find a term like that I haven't heard. So I know a lot of people listening haven't either.
So I think the interesting thing about science, and we get into this when we get into the discussion of reality here that
Mhm.
makes up the core of the book, science deals with our attempt to explain what we sense in our defined universe. And it is very quantum based. And by quantum, I mean it's based in everything has a smaller thing that makes it up, right? If
Right.
you go back and look at the philosophy of physics back to the early days, someone originally decided there was an atom. I forget who that was, but some philosopher decided there was an atom. Then someone decided, well, the atom must have something smaller than it. And as you keep moving your way down, we've continued that trek of finding the smaller and smaller piece, because science is on this quest to figure out, well, what's the smallest thing? Like what is, because it's almost like their quest for reality, right? Fundamentally,
Mhm.
what is it that everything has in common? Like what's the smallest common denominator of everything? And the problem is that scientific theory, physics theory, starts to break down as you get into these very, very tiny spaces. And quantum physics, quantum physics sort of suggests that there's no time. Like time is a illusory thing that happens just as you get to certain sizes. So as you get to certain scales, time exists, and conceptually
Mhm.
that makes sense to us, right? In order to actually have time, you have to have at least two things, and they have to somehow move around each other. Otherwise, time doesn't really exist,
Mhm.
because that's what it's there for. So you need some level of dimension to have time. And the quantum physics people are kind of moving into that almost dimensionless space where it's no longer quantum. It's like a no time area where everything exists because of this very, you know, supernatural is a funny word because I think supernatural just means things that we don't experience every day.
Okay.
But this very unusual existence below everything. And to me, that's a fascinating place to go because science, admittedly, and frankly, pretty much every religion in the world, admittedly, kind of starts with what I'd call like the creation story.
Hmm.
And so even in science, science does not have any description of the moment before what science calls the Big Bang. There's not really much of a description in religion of what happened just before creation. What was everybody doing just before creation? But the just before, even if before was timeless, is actually the original construct, right? Whatever that is, that's the original construct. What came out of it is just a manifestation out of it. But the original construct ultimately is that total reality. And the fact that astrophysics is moving more and more towards something that looks timeless, that's indescribable, from which everything emanates, is kind of like getting to things that I, came up with when I was doing my revelations, which is a sort of contextual, sort of fundamental basis of everything that things manifest out of. And we can talk about that later, but there's really good examples of it in just our biological existence that allow us to understand that. I think conceptually it's hard because we're used to thinking of time and space and quantum, but even astrophysics is starting to move into the direction of, well, maybe it's not quantum all the way below. Maybe it's, I don't know how better to describe it than a context, and the context from which all this manifests.
Okay. So and that's also interesting. Like I mean, we could go on for so long having this discussion about what we are going down to the smallest, and it seems like we do keep discovering, oh, now there are quarks and now there are these pieces, and it does just get smaller and smaller, and which I find fascinating because it just proves that we're all energy, essentially, moving, vibrating, shifting all the time. So I want to ask you, I mean, with the title, The All Manifesting, and I've seen a lot of the things you've posted about helping people to understand how to be intentional about being here. Like, what are you manifesting? This seems to be something I've been seeing you talk about. Can you talk a little bit about just the process of manifestation?
Yeah, I think it's easy to sort of think about just your daily life before you get into manifestation. And I'm not talking about
Hmm.
like the law of attraction here. I'm talking
Yeah.
about like our creation of a reality is what I'm talking about.
Right.
And I think that there is something to the law of attraction, other things like that that relate to it. But it's more about how do we create a reality. And so if we start where we just were, which is it's almost not part of our daily existence to understand real reality, because real reality is that this universe came out of something that we can't describe, and that something certainly exists because the universe couldn't have come out of it without of it. And maybe our universe is one of many things that manifest out of that context. But then even within our universe, where these biological structures, they came out on this planet. And I think the interesting first aha that came out of me was a lot of humans, I'm not saying all humans, but and I think maybe all of us from time to time believe that if we can't sense something, it's not real. Or we
Hmm.
can't see it, taste it, touch it, feel it, breathe it, it's not real.
Yeah.
And that's just that's not why your senses exist. They don't exist to define reality for you. Your senses exist to keep you alive as biological beings. They're a survival tool. And the interface between your mind and your senses existed for millions of years in a much, much simpler world than we have right now to use those things to basically keep you alive. That was your biological reason.
Hmm.
And now we've sort of come to this place where because it's so all encompassing, because our biological existence is so all encompassing, we tend to be overwhelmed by the fact that our reality is passively manifested by us. And again, I'm using the word manifested, meaning the creation of a reality. I'm not talking about, I write 7 things down and money comes to me tomorrow. I'm talking more
Right. Yeah.
about
Yeah.
manifestation of reality. And if
Hmm.
you begin to sit back and realize that every day you manifest unbelievably magical things. And let's start with just a simple one, which is the one I start with in the book. This particular universe that we happen to be in has a communications particle called the photon. It's the electromagnetic field's communication particle. That's how science would describe it. Photon's not really, it's a photon is really sort of supernatural. Like we don't run, I mean, even though we run into photons every day, we don't really run into photons every day. Photons not like a banana or a car or a rock or something. Photons this unusual packet of energy that sometimes is a wave and sometimes is a particle, and it has no luminosity in its existence. It has no color. It has different vibrations, and oddly, to stay alive and be biological beings, we developed eyes. We developed a brain that interacts with the eyes. Photon was a really good way for us to protect ourselves because the photon moves really fast, and so we can see
Mhm.
things coming at us. But color, light, everything that comes from a photon, that's all manifest by us. It's not, there's no luminosity in the universe without some sentient entity that has eyes that receive photons. We could have eyes that receive nitrogen gas, and we would just see nitrogen gas is luminous. We don't. Maybe some insects do. But we could have sound as our way of sensing things, like a bat, where
Yeah.
some of the blind. But that's not what happens with us. So when you realize that everything that comes in from your senses is not what you ultimately manifest it, touch is just basically a series of power fields that hold our atoms together on one hand, interacting with them on the other hand. We sense it as physical touch. It doesn't really exist as physical touch in true reality, but it does to us. Sound is just the movement of physical matter, obvious matter through the world that happens to bump into each other because of vibrations that something caused. And there's no sound, but there's sound if you have an eardrum and a brain that decides that you needed to hear something in order to be alive. So I think when you start with the fundamental understanding that almost everything that happens to you in a day that creates what you think of as your reality is just your brain's best manifestation effort to keep you alive, you begin to realize that most of what you manifest in a day is passive, right? I don't really think about any of that stuff. It passively happens to me. I'm not
Yeah.
actively saying I want that tree to look green. I'm not actively saying I want salt to taste salty. It's passive, and it's built in from a million years of biological development. So the first step, I think, is understanding that just at a very large fundamental level, this stuff that bothers us in a day, makes us happy or whatever, a lot of it we're passively, or maybe all of it, we're passively manifesting. And so, how do you change that? How do you say, there's this other stuff that goes on in my life? There are these fundamental intuitions that I have, these patterns. It's hard to call it an emotion, but patterns where there are weird influences I have or weird integrations with other things around me. And I'm saying weird in that
Mhm.
it's not what I'm normally used to in my day. Weird doesn't mean they're, not real.
Yeah.
But they lead me to do really fascinating things. They lead me to produce music or write a song, or they lead me to channel something, or they lead me to have a massive, premonition about something that will happen that for whatever reason other people aren't paying attention to,
Mhm.
because I'm sort of tied into some other vibration. And my passive manifestations, my passive reality might keep telling me that that's not real because I'm used to my passive manifestations. But I came to this realization, well, what if you could spend a lot of your time focusing on the, what I'm calling the weird stuff, instead of focusing on the passive stuff, and begin thinking about how you intentionally manifest following that pattern or that intuition or that integration that is not what we normally pay any attention to at all. Would that lead you to leading a much more full life with much less limitation? And my answer would be yes. And that's where this book sort of starts.
I love that. And I have to tell you, this is the first time I have heard this described this way, and I love it. That the senses that we have right now, our five main senses of experiencing the world around us, we have those, and those are so powerful because those are exactly what keep us alive. Like, oh, there's an apple on a tree, we're going to get that. And so we do dismiss all of these other ways that we can perceive information in the unseen realms. And now we understand, 300 years ago, no one would have believed that, small bugs lived on your skin. They would have thought, you are an insane person. You're a crazy person. There's no way that's real. There are no tiny bugs living on my skin. What are you talking about? Well, now we have powerful enough microscopes that can show, yes, there are actually little tiny bacteria and bugs that are crawling on your skin, in fact. And so I think there is this same piece that we're stepping towards of so much more information that is around us and perhaps within us, but it's right now, it's not as provable. But there are many people who know from their experiences, no, there's absolutely this realm, this field of information that you can tap into, be guided by, and have some kind of premonition, have information come into, and the more and more you trust that, integrate with it, that connection, that flow of information increases, it strengthens like any other muscle you would work with, I think. But I had just never thought about it in that way of how these primary senses are about our biological being alive, and our ego, our mind wants to dismiss the other and say that's not real, because it's not really having to do with keeping this biological structure alive necessarily. So that's an aha for me.
Well, good. I mean, it was an aha for me too, and obviously something I wanted to share. There's a ton of other modern biological issues that make that sensory based reality even more complex and more confusing to us. And I think spending time on a daily basis, and this is where I say this is like classic yoga, right? I think a very consistent meditation for classic yoga would be I am not my mind, I am not my body, right? Breathe in
Mm-hmm.
and breathe out. I actually do that same meditation every day. I'm not my mind, I'm not my body, I'm part of the energy that integrates everything and everyone. And I think when you say something like I just said there, the energy that connects everything and everyone, a lot of people's like triage nurse in their brain all of a sudden says, "This is woo woo. I'm going to throw this off to
Yeah.
the side." But I think what's very important for everybody to understand is whether you believe in science or you believe in philosophy or you believe in religion, every single one of those says that we exist at our smallest level in integrated fields, right? The Higgs field, which is a relatively new discovery
Mm-hmm.
for physics, we, all of our mass, an infinite amount of the energy in the universe, all in our universe, all stems from this field that we are all flowing through, connected with, and integrated with, and interacting with. So science will tell you that's true. I'm, every religion will talk about it in a different way, your soul or
Yeah.
whatever else, however else you want to believe it. And philosophy will talk about it the same sort of way. So it's interesting that biological feature of our brain that really, really cares about keeping us alive doesn't like us deviating from the script of
Yeah.
you need to just focus on the stuff that you sense because that's your primary purpose here is to be alive. And I would argue that maybe we're lucky enough that our primary purpose is not just that. And maybe our primary purpose is that since we're not, if we're lucky, not generally facing starvation or something else, that our almost luxury is that we can spend our time maybe tracing back to those like earlier connections where we weren't so overwhelmed with what was coming in from our senses that we could more align ourselves with what even doctors will call like your inner compass. Might be one way to talk
Mm-hmm.
about it. Or as Vadim in Transurfing Reality talks about, your soul, the intuition of your soul kind of concept, the listening to the rustling of the stars. I think he said poetically, but those sorts of things I think you should spend a lot more time of your day doing than, other things that are frankly there just to keep you around.
Yeah, that's interesting. It makes me wonder too, like with modern life, when you think back to like some ancient people, the things they were able to do, the philosophy, like you look at the ancient Egyptians, and when life wasn't so fast, and there was so much information bombarding you all the time. I wonder if we had more of these connections to the unseen world. And as life gets faster and faster, it's sort of that kind of closes that doorway even more, even more. And now, like it's almost like breath. I would see it like humanity maybe was more open, and then it got closed, and now we're coming to this point where we're like, hold on a second, we're opening these doors back up, and more people are sort of like the more and more books that are written like this, or podcasts, or information from people who are, I think you're a really great person to be bringing this information, because you're not a woo woo person. You're a very, respected business leader. You come from a very storied family. Can we talk about who your family is?
Sure. Unfortunately,
Sure, Pew Research, like the Pew Research family. This is Derek Pew of that. So having someone like a Derek Pew come out with this, beautiful information, I think makes it more um, like believable, or people will allow themselves to believe that it's possible. So it's really wonderful to see people like you coming forward with these revelations, I feel like.
I appreciate that. I mean, there's a really interesting book. I like pushing these very important books that were written, but Thinking Fast and Slow, that was written by the late Daniel Kahneman, who was a
Okay.
Nobel Prize winning psychological economist. He was studying like how our brains evolved to work, and this is to the point that you're making. We biologically evolved to not waste our energy on thinking, mostly because humans face starvation for the vast majority of our existence. So we sort of came up with these two brain functions that Daniel Kahneman discovered, or at least talked about. They're not like biophysical functions. They're really just how our brains manage information. We called it
Okay.
type one thinking and type two thinking. And in type one thinking, there's no gatekeeper determining whether something is true. It's just taking repetitive affirmations, and based on the affirmation, it determines that that is true. So that we don't have to think about something. Like if we taste an apple
Mhm.
3 or 4 times and decide it's sweet, we don't have to think that it's sweet. If our parents look frightened at an angry dog a couple times while we're a child, we learn that the dog is something we should be worried about. And so this affirmative thing worked really well when all of our affirmations were coming from the natural world and weren't
Mhm.
that often. If you lived in a cave dwelling someplace, or you're hunting for your food, the amount of stimulating information that was causing this affirmative effect in your brain wasn't coming rapid fire at you. And in the modern world, algorithms have learned that that is a backdoor sort of brain hack, where if you want to convince somebody of something, you just have to provide a lot of repetition to them. And that kind of noise is really complex for a biological, sense based reality creator that hasn't really evolved dramatically in the last 1,000 years or even 200
Mhm.
years. When you realize that, and this is something I talk about in the book too, when you realize that, for the last maybe 70 years, we've started to get most of our information from a radio and then the television and now into computers and smartphones. And if you sit back and say, during the course of a day, where does my unfortunately affirmative, affirmation side of my brain get most of its affirmations from? It's not the natural world. For most of us, it's some computer, and the
Right.
whatever it is that's behind that computer is an algorithm that knows this problem with your brain. It was a great, successful, part of our biological evolution. Helped us survive extremely well, but as modern beings, it's a liability. And so, yes, I think in a lot of these teachings, because they didn't happen in a modern world, when say someone in a yoga culture says you need to look inward or something to really understand the nature of things or can't look outward. What they're missing is that in this current society, so many things changed in the last 150 years, both causing biological changes in our minds and literally just how our brains were set up to keep us surviving, that this passively created reality is, as we said earlier on, it just gets more and more complicated. And trying to find your way back out of it becomes a process because you have to rewire yourself to understand that it may feel like reality to you. It may have all the all the component parts of a reality, but we are drifting further and further away from what is actual reality as we go more and more into these technology ages. And I think there's a big part of my book that spends time on that, whether it's electromagnetic force or whether it's algorithms in social media or like propaganda and marketing that was really developed during the industrial age. All of that is intended to push your brain into a dictated passive reality instead of you choosing what your reality is. It makes it harder. So that's sort of a big topic that the book spends most of like the second half trying to show you. I think because understanding it helps you better unwind it in the end. And in the end, I think one other thing that I'd like to say from there, I know I've been talking for a
Yeah,
while here,
you're right.
is that as you begin to understand, even think about how your mind does that, I think it begins again in sort of like classic yoga way to bring you into a better understanding of what reality really is like. And to me, and one of the key points I make in this book is that you can understand the universe much better by understanding your own relationship between your consciousness and your thoughts. Hermetic belief or Hermetic New Thought belief is this concept that the universe is mental. And that doesn't mean that there's a physical mind that the universe is in, but at least from my own revelations, what that means is the universe is much more like the interface between your consciousness and your thoughts, right? Your consciousness, which has really no time or dimension to it, produces these what I would call like quantum. They're like physics would call them quantum in the universe. These quantum are our thoughts that make up our reality. And I think that that's a much better insight into the sort of context that created our universe. And so we have in our own biological form a really, really good way of looking inward to begin to understand how our reality and the reality of the universe are the same, and at the same time maybe start intentionally manifesting in that.
Okay. And I like this idea of intentionally manifesting within that. So, do you what you talked about? One of the ways to do that is this sort of this integration between your consciousness and your mind. Do you talk about a technique for like more fully integrating those pieces?
Yeah, I think that the technique starts with at first you have to like unwind yourself from the unreality, the reality that is built up over maybe a lifetime that was passively created in order to get to
Okay.
your intentionally created reality, because the passive reality will get in the way. Like as you begin to intentionally manifest the passive reality is going to second guess you. It's going to limit you. It's going to tell you
Mhm.
that what you're doing is not real because it's not like the passive reality. It's different, and that's the constant struggle. I think when people talk about practices, right, in meditation or yoga or anything else, it's
Mhm.
because it's constant. Because our biological existence keeps trying to drive us the other direction. It's
Yeah.
just how we're wired. So I think on a daily basis, at least initially, um, understanding how the algorithms are modifying how you think, understanding fundamentally that all the things that you're manifesting in a day, whether it's color, light, what someone's saying to you, sound, touch or taste, or whatever that happens to be, if you can begin to start pushing those off to the side and say, these are all really valuable. Some of them can be beautiful. I can see beautiful colors. I can smell beautiful things, bad things too. I can hear amazing things. Those are wonderful parts about being alive. You don't want to get rid of them. But if you better understand them as just wonderful things or helpful things as opposed to reality, then you can start moving your way into almost through repetition, reprogramming yourself. And my wife in her podcast would talk about it as neuroplasticity. That's very biological for me. And
Hmm.
her stuff is great, but different. But
Yeah.
same idea of
Hmm.
you're whether the affirmations, because this is how you're set up, are coming from a third party or they're coming from you, they're the same. Your brain treats them the same. And if you begin affirming in yourself every single day that I am living in my intuitive space. I am making decisions off of my internal compass, my integration with other things. I'm not making decisions based off of whatever fears, limitations, or other things that come out of what I'm just calling these things that aren't my reality.
Hmm.
You begin to live your life that way, and it does change how other people um, integrate with you. I think it changes how the universe interacts with you because you're in a different intentional space. You're moving away from just basically being a passive reality creator.
Yeah. So it sounds like the beginning of this journey was you recognized that you had these self-limiting beliefs, and this began this part of this journey. Were you, as part of this journey, getting really honest and understanding what those self-limiting beliefs were, sort of naming them and like going through like a Rolodex? It's, these different beliefs that are self-limiting. And then did you have a process for working with and sort of transmuting those self-limiting beliefs during this process?
Yeah, I'll give you a really good example, and I'm going to give you because it's similar to mine. One of our daughters was not happy with her job and
Hmm.
had gotten a master's degree in something. And as she was getting turned down from her jobs, the first thing people would say is, "Well, we couldn't hire you because you don't have an MBA," even though she had a master's degree in something else.
Okay.
And so she came back to me and said, "Dad, like, I'm not going to get a job without an MBA." And I said, that statement is the self-limiting belief.
Yeah.
The reality is that when you go out and look for a new job, most of the times people are going to say no. And people don't like saying no. So they're going to look at your resume. They're going to come up with an answer as to why they said no. That's the easiest, most logical one for them to give. So it's not an emotional note for them anymore. It's something pragmatic.
Hmm.
So it's like, so this is interesting. So you have the self limiting belief in your mind, and then you have this affirmation thing happening in the real world. It's
Right.
reaffirming to you every time somebody says to you, you don't have an MBA, you'd already put that self limiting belief in your mind. Well, let me tell you that what's happening out in the real world is not an affirmation. If you can just distance yourself from that and say, realize that the real world's not trying to affirm your self limiting belief, it's just happening. And if you perceive it as a self limiting belief, it will build that affirmation inside you and you'll carry that with you wherever you go. It'll make it more and more true in your mind that that is your problem. So I said to her, look, you're better, well suited, probably the best candidate any of these people ever have, but you will just have only a 10% chance or a 5% chance of someone saying yes, not because there's something wrong with you, but because that's just how it works. Just like it rains
Right.
on certain days or it's sunny on certain days. They're not affirmations. They're just things. And so I think if you begin to understand that that's how your mind works, then whatever the limitation is that someone probably put in your head, your parents told you that you wouldn't be successful, or you have an ex-spouse that gave you a hard time and was angry with you and told you things about you that weren't true. But when those
Yeah.
people say things over and over again, then what your brain does automatically, passively, is it goes out and looks for affirmations of them. And those affirmations, like I said, they're not there to affirm. They're just things. They're just things. And they happen randomly out in the real world. So I think one of the good practices is to begin to disassociate those two things, identify where, like, the nature of what that self limiting thought is. And then instead of seeing something as an affirmation of it, tell yourself that that thing that was out there was maybe just a way for you to see what the limiting thought was in you in the first place, and disassociate the two. You take the energy from that anxiousness and move it to something intentional. There was sort of a revelation I had one morning. I was like really anxious about some business that I was working on launching. And I realized that there were sort of two things to the concept of anxiety for me. There was that emotional belief, which was based on some self limiting thought. And then there was this power, the energy that I put into it. And if I could take like the thought and put it off to the side and disassociate with the energy and apply the energy to an intentional manifestation, anxiety went away. So there's a lot of ways to disarm that, just understanding how you happen to have been given this body and how this brain is going to work, where I think you can sit back and intentionally uh, disassociate, disaffirm, and wind up with an intentional manifestation at that point, which is no, I'm not going to spend my time wasting the energy on this self limiting thought or whatever it comes out of it. I'm going to take that energy that I had in there, I'm going to apply it to this thing that I absolutely want to accomplish today. It's different.
Yeah.
That's intentional. And it's not, and but the other one was passive, it just appeared.
Okay. That's great advice. That's great advice. I think, and also when I think that when you catch yourself having a belief like your daughter had, well, I'm not going to get a job without an MBA. I mean, there's like, I think for any person, when you find this a belief where you in your daily life that you are having this belief that that is limiting, that's a good place to then re-examine why you have that and how you can kind of alchemize that into a new, like widen that and other possibilities.
Yeah, I think
Maybe a cue, like a cue for you that you're self-limiting. We're not always aware that we are having a self-limiting belief. It's a belief and we don't recognize it as being self-limiting. So I think it's becoming really thoughtful and mindful about what that internal dialogue is saying.
and your brain doesn't want to do this either, right? Because the other kind of thought that Kahneman showed was called system two, or type two thought. And that's the one where we're really thinking, like we're really concentrating.
Mhm.
We don't like to do that. Humans will avoid doing that almost at all cost. There are tests, giant, large scientific tests, psychology tests will show that. But you have to like tell yourself, I'm not conserving energy to like not starve anymore. I can actually spend
Yeah.
my time using my system two thought that my body doesn't really want to use, and do what you just said, Christine, which
Yeah.
is apply it to this process of introspection, of figuring out, okay, well, where am I limiting myself? There could be things that happen in the outside world that will limit you, but you shouldn't be living under any pattern where you're limiting yourself. Why would you? Well, we all do, and
Right.
trying to get out from under that, it was, as you said, was the core purpose of why I started this whole thing in the first place.
And now with that, since you started it, I mean, do you feel a sense of liberation from that?
I
Like
would say,
how has that shifted the way you feel in your body now?
well, I would say it's sort of a constant practice. I think you
Yeah.
just get incrementally better at it over time. It
Mhm.
would be great to say that, and I think it's interesting when you see talking heads on TV telling you absolutes about what you can do for yourself. I Yeah, maybe it's possible, but that's not how you're biologically wired. So I think it's a constant practice. You constantly try to get better at it. Give yourself credit for getting better at it, right? There'll be times where I'll say something and be like, oh my God, why did I say that? Like, that's so
Yeah.
self-limiting. Why would I ever say, like, for example, this book? I think somebody said to me, well, only, a small number of people would ever want to read this book. And my reaction was, why shouldn't everybody want to read this book? Like, why would you limit? Why would you
Yeah.
create that limitation? Yes, I understand it's a complicated book. I understand the fundamental reasons why you might say something like that, but there's no reason to put any of those limitations on yourself. And I would say, in some contexts, you might only have so much time in a day, so you need to focus on the things you think are more probable to do in business. And maybe that's a limitation, but it's a pragmatic limitation. You're doing it. But it's the ones that are insidious, like the ones that you're not, it has nothing to do with prioritization or anything else, but it just pops up. that you really need to sit back and say, where the hey did that come from? And why would I make myself less fulfilled than I should be because of that thought? And maybe I'll spend some time figuring out where that came from. It might be really obvious to you. Someone said it to you, some parent, some
Yeah.
loved one, some business person, some event happened to you that made you think something. And maybe you can easily identify it, but then unlocking it from both the energy and unlocking it from affirmations becomes that journey. And look, I'm an entrepreneur. I'm going to fail way more than I succeed. If someone in my life told me that I was a failure, every time I failed, I would get worse. I wouldn't get better,
Yeah.
right? Um, I think Michael Jordan used to say this. He like missed more game-winning shots than he made, but it was the resilience and that affirmative, non-self-limiting belief to try to do it, even if a self-limiter would say, "I'm not going to take the shot because I failed the last time, or I failed 10 times, or I failed 20 times." Those are the more insidious ones, and you have to begin to like break free of those. And I think, look, you can get into this deeper understanding of the entire universe that I wanted to get into because I like to get into the very fundamental part of it. But I,
Hmm.
I think in some ways, if you can get yourself there, it really liberates you. And you can always go back to that conception of, this is like, I'm part of this like energy system that's out there. I'm in some context limitless. I have my own whatever reason for being that has some compass associated with it. And if I can keep making decisions that are aligned with that, what someone might call the intuition of your soul, I think I call that in the book. Internal compass is what James Doty would call it in his book. Um, uh, I guess your karma, maybe in some ways, in certain terms of classic yoga. When you're all in alignment, when there's correspondence to what you're doing, it's powerful. Like what you can do is absolutely powerful because you're vibrating the same on every energy level, every plane. I would say highly successful people are people that resonate extremely well across all their planes. They know what their mission is. They commit themselves. Everything they do is around that sense of what they want to do, what they want to be, what they want to accomplish. And they don't self limit themselves at all because they just know in their soul that's what they're supposed to do. Wouldn't that be a great place for everybody to be? And
Yeah.
why couldn't you intentionally spend your time trying to figure that out every day?
Yeah. I mean, it's really like you're describing like your soul mission, like you're really in touch with what your soul came here like to do, I feel like. And that can change for people. I know a lot of people can feel very confused, like there just be one thing that I need to do. You look at Derek though. Derek has this huge long range of hobbies and talents and businesses and startups. So it doesn't have to be I need to find exactly this thing, but what are you here to express? How is your soul expressing in the world?
Well, that's something that I've spent a lot of time with recently. It's interesting. You don't want to be the golden retriever chasing after every squirrel in the yard. And
Right.
there is a conflict, a little bit of a conflict between things that intellectually stimulate you and things that stimulate you passionately. And I
Mhm.
think fusing those two things becomes kind of the mission, right? That's part of finding what really makes you tick. Is It is incredibly intellectually stimulating to me. It is incredibly emotionally stimulating to me. It aligns with why I feel I'm here. And I think you do wander a little bit looking for those things. And
Yeah.
sometimes, the pathway may not be all that linear. You may be on something that's not exactly right, but it leads you to something else. And I think you just have to keep your eyes open for it. And then like I'm lucky that I'm a musician. There's parts of this practice of just understanding that connective flow that I think sports, art, music, even hiking, I mean, whatever the
Mhm.
activities are that make you feel connected, you can spend time in those activities using them as a practice for this channel type flow of aligning yourself. I spend a lot of time now in music, learning the music well enough that when I go to play it, I don't have to think about it. So that
Huh?
when I'm performing, I'm just flowing. Uh, I think basketball players flow, really great basketball players flow in a game. They don't try. And there should be no reason why we can't flow in our work, flow. It's
Yeah.
we all have experiences with us, and it's just something you spend like no time thinking, gee, what was the pattern of that really intense flow that I had? And how do I move into that all the time? How many people spend hours of their day doing that as opposed to worrying about like where the traffic's going to be on, I-15 or whatever your highway is? So I think if anything comes out of this book is that this concept of meditation or spending time every day on this is just a critical part of the practice of trying to get into intentional manifestation.
Yeah, and it sounds like when you talk about there's through reading this book and some of the information, like even if you are stuck in traffic on the I-15, okay, that can be this time for your intentional meditation. Like, what am I manifesting? Do I have some self-limiting beliefs arising in the moment? So to keep you clear, to keep you open and to get intentional about like integrating this other aspect of you, this higher aspect that wants to express through this biological being. It feels like.
That's a really good way to say it, Christine. Now, actually, you said that better than I said it the entire interview, so that's perfect. It's exactly right.
I don't think that you had a lot of wisdom that dropped here. You clearly are such an incredible wealth of information. I could talk to you about all kinds of subjects. You're so interesting in these thoughts, and you know so much about so many subjects that you weave it all together in this really beautiful, neat little package. That's I could sit and listen to it for hours and hours and hours. Um, so I may have to get you on again to talk a little bit more because this has been really fun for me to hear your thoughts on these topics.
Yeah, this has been a great conversation, and like I said, this is. I mean, I hope people wind up reading the book just because I want them to hear these thoughts and start thinking about it. I think it's something that people should read, and I think even from what I've seen, people are going to come away from it very differently depending on where they are in this sort of altered reality state, where they are in the passive manifestation side.
Yeah.
It will have them attached to this book in different ways. So whenever somebody says, "Oh, I bought the book," I always say, "Well, I really want to hear what you thought of that. Like what it came to you." And so a lot of times, someone will come back to me and say something I never even thought of, but that's in some way sort of demonstrates their passive reality trying to pigeonhole the book into something, that
Right.
makes it more approachable or more understandable or maybe less scary, more
Mm-hmm.
safe. And I'll go back to them and say, well, I was really trying to say this, like a little bit deeper than that. That's why I say, like, if you get the book and you read it, give it some breath. Like, read a couple sentences and think about it. Uh, there's going to be things in there that challenge you in terms of what you think is real, and someone's going to pick it up and say, "This is wahooey. Like, none of this
Yeah.
is real." And okay, I'm sorry that you're there and you're not able to move into someplace else where you can start to at least think about this. I don't care whether you make it your belief system, but you should at least think about it. And yeah, I'm excited actually for the journey to hear back from people now that the book is out.
So I have a question for you about the book.
Mhm.
I have not read it yet. I'm excited to read it. I'm a terrible, as it turns out, book reader lately. I have piles and piles of books that I have to get through. Um, but I do listen to Audible. So any chance you're going to do a recording of this book?
Yeah, it's actually in process. For anybody that's done a book before, and this is brand new for me,
Yeah.
it's really kind of crazy the competition between Barnes and Noble and Amazon, other sources, how you get them out both globally and domestically, and then how audiobooks are finally put together. Kind of what happens is the ebook is the easiest to get out, and that goes out first, and then the
Okay.
published book makes it out. Mine literally just became a published book like 2 days ago or 3 days ago.
Mhm.
And then in that, the audiobook comes out, and the audiobook takes a fair amount of metadata, and it just, it doesn't happen overnight. I
Yeah.
think for if this book were to become really popular, someone might say, "Hey, Derek, will you read it?" so that it's your voice. But most audiobooks are created by artificial intelligence, but it's a lot of metadata and it takes a while. So it will be out on audiobook,
Oh,
but it's in publishing process. I have no idea what the release date's going to be, but as soon as it's
okay.
out, I'll tell everybody.
You'll have to let us know. Okay, so how do people find you, connect with you? I know you're on Instagram. If you can tell people your website and all of your information so if they want to look into you.
Yeah, sure. The Instagram is the all manifesting, it's the
Hmm.
underline all underline manifesting. And if you just want to follow on thoughts from the book and see if you think it's interesting to you, there's a lot of
Hmm.
little quotes in there that stem from the book and other thoughts that emerge from the book that's there. I have a website. There's a interesting blog. I After rereading Einstein's theory of general relativity in the context of the book, I wrote like a mirror copy called The Contextual Theory of Reality that matches against Einstein's. It's on my website page, which is derek-pugh.com. So you can see anything there. Facebook's the same as the All Manifesting. And of course, like the book is on, I think the book is now available, not audio yet, but available in either electronic or print format in 20 different like sites to go grab it. Obviously, the
Okay.
biggest one is Amazon, but
Amazon.
it's in Apple, it's in Amazon, it's in Borders, it's all over the place. Barnes and Noble.
Okay, Derek, I'm excited to dive into that book.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
excited to hear your reaction.
yes. Thank you so much for coming on, sharing your thoughts and your wisdom. I think everyone who's listened today are going to get a lot out of it and a lot to think about. So thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Christine. This has been a lot of fun.
All right. And thank you all for staying with us. We'll see you next time.